Calvin's very clear that God ordained the fall. Okay. And so you can't just jump to, you got this damned mass of humans who God can then sovereignly save some and pass over others and they get what they want. No, God, and there's just no way around this. God in some sense ordained, desired. I mean, I don't think we can get away from desired, the fall.
He says Fischer also describes reprobation in terms that are more extreme than even a superlapsarian Calvinist would use. All of them? Really? Are you sure? Have you listened to all of them, DeYoung? Just saying, brother. Have you listened to all of them? Because I promise you,
I don't know if he's listened to some
Fischer,
of his buddies preach.
I don't know if he's listened to some of the extreme superlapsarian Calvinists that I've listened to, but I'm not sure if he should use such sweeping terms as this. But while he is right to insist, DeYoung says, while he's right to insist that Calvinists own up to double predestination, his description of the position, i.e. God creates people in order to damn them, is not how Reformed theologians have explained reprobation. Now, wait, just 1 second there. Okay. Your statement is God creates people in order to damn them. And he's saying that's not how Reformed theologians have explained reprobation. Excuse me real quick, Austin. I have to do this. Here is John Calvin. I would consider him a reformer, right? I would consider him a Calvinist. Is Calvinist?
Yeah, he's on Mount Rushmore there.
Okay, all right. Okay, he wrote, "We call predestination God's eternal decree by which he compacted with himself what he willed to become of each man. For all are not created," he even uses the word created, "all are not created in equal condition. Rather, eternal life is foreordained for some, eternal damnation for others," end quote. Do you think DeYoung would sign off on that statement by John Calvin, since it's coming from John Calvin, while accusing you of not understanding Calvinism when you virtually said the exact same thing?
Yeah, I assume he would agree with Calvin. There is a little bit of wiggle room there in Calvin's quote, just in that it doesn't touch the fall, and so again, what most Calvinists do is when it comes to the positive side of predestination, right? So predestination unto salvation. Mm-hmm. God's action is explained in very aggressive, actionable terms. God doesn't wait for your decision. God sovereignly elects certain people unto salvation. So it's very aggressive, active language. But when it comes to the decree of reprobation, right? So that second part of double predestination, all of a sudden the language about God's action gets very passive, right? And DeYoung uses it there. God passes over certain people. Idea being, you've got this huge group of damned humanity, right? Everybody deserves hell. And then God graciously and actively chooses some for salvation. And then the rest of them, God passes over them and lets them get what they deserve. Right. And that, there's some qualms you could still have with that, but that, I get it. And that works. But again, the problem, and Calvin was very clear on this. I don't have the quote in front of me. I'll find it, but Calvin's very clear that God ordained the fall. Okay. And so you can't just jump to, you got this damned mass of humans who God can then sovereignly save some and pass over others and they get what they want. No, God, then there's just no way around this. God in some sense ordained, desired. I mean, I don't think we can get away from desired, the fall. And so that's where I think DeYoung right there and many Calvinists don't quite bite the bullet, is they jump to this huge damned mass of humanity that God is then free to do what he wants with. And they skip over God in some sense ordaining the fall. And that gets to the infra and supralapsarianism. But again, I think most of the leading Calvinist Augustinian thinkers understood that you needed to affirm that God ordained and desired even the fall.
Well, and I'll put it up on the screen. I was able to find it there. Well, even at the bottom of the screen, you can see it says salvation is freely offered to some while it's barred from access to others. So that doesn't sound like he's just passing them by. It sounds like he's actually barring them from access, at least according to that quote. Here's another quote from Calvin. "Again, I ask, whence does it happen that Adam's fall irremediably involved so many peoples together with their infant offspring in eternal death, unless because it so pleased God? The decree is dreadful indeed, I confess. Yet no one can deny that God foreknew what the end man was to have before he created him, and consequently foreknew because he so ordained it by his decree. And it ought not seem absurd for me to say that God not only foresaw the fall of the first man, and in him the ruin of his descendants, but also meted it out in accordance with his own decision, end quote.
Yeah, that's the quote.
Yeah, that's the one. Well, and there's other ones that are more direct even than that one, if I can find it here. Man's fall according to God's providence ordains, but he falls by his own fault. So it's according to the providence and ordaining it, but yet still Adam's at fault. In other words, he's held responsible for what God has decreed for him to do, which is what the mystery of the entire system entails. And then here's another one. The first man fell because the Lord deemed it meet that he should, end quote. And so you really can't get away from just that blatant claim of at least John Calvin and his form of Calvinism, if no one else.
No, I completely agree. And I've had a number of conversations with, again, good, thoughtful Calvinist people who want to deny God ordaining the fall. And I just always push them and say, look, it is incumbent upon you to explain how you can deny that, because, again, all the greatest Augustinian Calvinist thinkers did affirm it because they saw that's where the logic necessarily led, and they had enough theological integrity to not bail out at that moment.
Right. Yeah. Well, he goes on, and again, he talks about that a little bit longer, but he goes on to bring this critique: have the problems with Arminianism been squarely faced? Is the next critique that he brings. He writes this. He says, the most effective aspect of No Longer Reformed is how Fischer forces us to stare at the doctrine of reprobation and consider whether this is a picture of God we can live with. There is no doubt that double predestination is a tough pill to swallow, and that reprobation can feel like a horrible decree, to use Calvin's phrase. I think in the end, the best thing the Calvinists can say is, who are we to talk back to God? Romans 9:20. And who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor? Romans 11:34. Fischer eventually comes to find this response untenable. For my part, I resonate with Bavinck's appeal that Calvinism, quote, invites us to rest in him who lives in unapproachable light, whose judgments are researchable, and whose paths are beyond tracing out, end quote. What do you say to that?
Yeah, the Romans 9 and 11, that whole deal is certainly very interesting. As to the specific question of, whether or not all the problems with Arminianism have been squared, that's a really interesting one where neither in the book nor ever have I specifically identified as an Arminian. I'm not saying that I'm not. I probably in some ways am, but I think some of the Arminian Calvinism arguments, they were predicated on much later theological conflicts about soteriology, which is obviously fitting for this particular podcast. But the basic distinction that I'm trying to draw attention to in the book, because it was the one at the heart of my journey, is really not about soteriology, strictly speaking, but it's about who God is. And of course, soteriology is a result of that. But it's my conviction that the majority classical Christian consensus involves something like free will. I don't know if libertarian is the right word, because it's not like we can just choose whatever we want and there are no constraints upon our will. No, but some form of real created freedom is something God granted to humans in creating us in his own image. I don't think that some version of freedom is incoherent, right? There's some scholars who think free will itself is incoherent. But if we are to affirm that God has free will, and I think we have to, then clearly the idea of free will isn't incoherent, even if we struggle to understand exactly how it works. We have a free will that is in some sense analogous to God's free will. The Arminian piece, there are questions, and I freely admit there are pieces in it that are difficult. Like, what causes someone, like what pushes you over the edge to choose or not choose to follow Christ? I don't know how anyone could possibly answer that question. It's not answerable to me. And so every theological system has its struggles, but it's certainly my conviction that the struggles and mysteries that you have to live with, and what I would just call classical theism, of which Arminianism is a later expression, they're like proper biblical mysteries, and not mysteries that call into question whether or not Jesus Christ is the exhaustive revelation of God or not. And that's what you bump into with Calvinism. Is Jesus really the whole story? And I don't think Calvinists can affirm that Jesus is the whole story. Jesus is a part of the story, but behind Jesus, there's this hidden God who is kind of the exact opposite of Christ, a hidden God who, and again, I don't think you can get away from this language, in some sense desires that most people would end up in hell or tortured forever or annihilated or, whatever the case may be.
Well, and the mystery that you appealed to with regard to free will is not a mystery that's uncommon even among Reformed theologians, because when it comes to Adam and Eve, we have, for example, R.C. Sproul, who has said this, but Adam and Eve were not created fallen. They had no sin nature. They were good creatures with a free will, yet they chose to sin. Why? I don't know, nor have I found anyone else that does know. So
has he read Calvin?
Yeah, because God ordained
Calvin
it is the answer for the right
Calvin
Calvinist.
knows.
Yeah. And so he's appealing to the mystery of the first choice because he can't blame it on the fall in nature, i.e. the desired will that's constrained by the bondage of the fall. And so he doesn't have a reason as to why Adam and Eve chose to sin, except to appeal to mystery. And that's the same mystery where we think the Bible affords with regard to every choice that we make that's a moral choice that's free. The cause of a choice is the chooser. The cause of a determination is the determiner. Why did God choose to create when he could have not created? We don't know. I mean, we just know that he determined that. Well, why do I choose to follow Christ and my neighbor doesn't choose to follow Christ? That's why I'm responsible for that, because it's my choice. I'm the determiner of that. And that's where I think the mystery should rest, is right there on that point. And I think we should leave it at that instead of projecting onto the scriptures philosophical nonsense, I think, and begin to say, okay, a deterministic answer must be required here, begging the question. And we must answer the question, what determined for that free agent to do what he did, because it couldn't have been the free agent, therefore undermining what free will is all about. Don't you think?
No, I agree. And again, what's so ironic about Sproul's quote here is, I mean, I could sign off 100% on that. I just don't think he can say that. Again, having just read the Calvin quote, that's why Calvin was the best Calvinist, man, is he was very consistent and he wasn't afraid to bite the bullet. And so when Sproul says something like that, I want to stand up and applaud and agree, but then just say, but you can't really say that. It's not consistent for you to say that.